Greetings and welcome to our series of weekly devotionals. We're looking this week at verses in the book of Isaiah, chapter 5. My mom used to love the show Matlock, and in a lot of those sort of whodunit type shows, Murder, She Wrote, or Ellery Queen, or Perry Mason, the star of the show at the end of the show would never just kind of say who did it. They would go into this long speech explaining every detail of how they came to conclude who the perpetrator of the crime was, and they would sort of drag things out. And of course, in these shows, I think the purpose of it was suspense, to create a feeling of suspense for the viewer as they wonder who done it. In this chapter of the book of Isaiah, scholars note that Isaiah has done the same thing in this passage, because he writes about this vineyard, and readers may wonder about this metaphor. Who is Isaiah referring to as the vineyard? Who is God speaking about in this passage? And of course, eventually we get to the conclusion of this question. In verse 7, Isaiah writes, "For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the people of Judah are his pleasant planting." God is, of course, referring to the people of God, which we probably have deduced up until this point. But scholars also note that this sort of delay in Isaiah getting to this point may also have a purpose, and not just to build suspense, because those scholars sort of allude to a similar passage in the book of Samuel, the story of David and Bathsheba, where Nathan sort of skirts around the issue of David's sinfulness, David's error, David's mistake and failings in this story. And the reason for Nathan sort of taking an indirect approach to pointing out that David is the culprit in the story is because he wants David to come to this conclusion on his own. He doesn't want to just tell David, it's your fault. He wants David to understand himself that he is the culprit in this story. Of course, because I think when we come to those kinds of conclusions on our own, it generally tends to result in a more effective change in ourselves. I think this is true with the people of Israel and Isaiah. Isaiah wants them to sort of take ownership of the issues, the problems, the sinfulness that they are perpetrating against toward the Lord. Of course, hoping that if they take ownership and invest themselves into those problems, if they realize and become self-aware, that will lead to a more effective change. I think certainly this is true in our own time and place. In most counseling and chaplaincy work, we don't try and tell people what they need to do to change. We try to be patient, listen, and sort of indirectly get those folks to come to that realization themselves. And when we do those kinds of things, when we can sort of take ownership and be accountable for the things that we've done, that sort of leads to a more lasting and effective change. And so perhaps in our lives of faith and our relationship with God, we might reflect upon those ways that we have fallen short, and the sinfulness in our own lives, sort of the failings in our relationship with God, and take ownership of those things. And certainly more so than a preacher or a pastor or someone else telling us how to change, when we realize ourselves sort of the things that we need to change and take ownership of them, I think that is probably always the best course of action for us. So I hope and pray that we might do that, reflect upon ourselves, become self-aware, and change what we can and change what we must. Amen.